this email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Welcome back to part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Colin Fisher, professor, speaker, and author of The Collective Edge. We pick up the discussion with Colin explaining how task complexity determines whether you should work alone or in a group, and when collaboration becomes a liability.
Task complexity is this idea that, a task has more components, right? That there's more criteria to it, there's more different skills to it, and that groups have the biggest advantage over individuals when tasks are complex. And, it's kind of easy to understand why, because complex tasks require more minds, more different kinds of expertise. They benefit from more perspectives. But when you're working on very, very simple tasks, this is where we don't see that same advantage. So if, all we're doing is we're out and we're shoveling snow out of our driveway, right? And we don't need a whole bunch of special expertise to do that. There's not a lot of benefit of interdependence that we have. Then saying, we're going to do this in teams is going to have a much smaller advantage over a more complex task like, developing a new product or something like that. And that, if it's a super easy repetitive task, like, back in the days when human beings were actually stuffing letters into envelopes and mailing them all out, then, those kind of tasks really are better for individual management systems rather than trying to have teams do them often. But, very little work now in organizations is being done that way, that we don't, we've automated or outsourced most of our simplest work already. And so almost all the things now that we have to do are complex, and they're actually getting more complex with the advent of AI doing a lot of this work, that, it keeps bumping up, humans have to keep doing the more intense cognitive work more and more of the time. And so almost everything is now to the point where we'd be better off with a group doing it than an individual.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of groups, but I know there's sometimes it's just I need to put my head down and just get this thing knocked out, and I don't need any help to get it done.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, if it really is, the coordination is a real cost. It's not, that's not an imaginary thing, that takes time, it takes effort, and that there are plenty of situations where we don't need a group. I would say I see this the most in either student project groups and classroom assignments where, the instructor gives a group a project that's actually an individual task. Like, writing a paper is not actually an amazing group task. If I say, let's have a group do this, because the coordination costs are actually quite high if you're trying to co-work on a written document, and this kind of logic of I'm going to assign it to a group because it's easier for me as an instructor because then I have fewer things to grade is kind of bad logic. But we also see that in organizations with things like committees who are commissioning reports and things of that nature, where sometimes we're giving groups work that would have been better given to an individual working alone. And, that's something that we really do need to take seriously and think about, and not just reflexively give things to groups or to use groups in largely political ways. To say, I'm going to, make this a committee because I'm afraid of upsetting a bunch of people, rather than we actually need their perspectives and we actually need their input on this project.
Yeah, maybe change the template so that the first thing isn't always, let's pull a team together.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
I know a lot of times people, leaders especially, will assume that if I add somebody that's more talented to a team, it's automatically going to improve results, but that's not really the case, is it?
No, it's really not. And that the relationship between talent and teams is not that simple. So I think the kind of top line is skills matter more than sort of absolute level of talent. And so, I think, again, this kind of sports metaphor helps us. If we create an all-star team, but everyone plays the same position and we don't actually think about what people are good at and whether they're providing all the skills necessary, and that when I talked about the Scream team, so the 2004 U.S. men's Olympic basketball team that got the bronze medal, the first one in a long time not to get the gold medal, that they put together the biggest names, so people who may have seemed like they were the most talented, but they didn't actually think about what the difference between Olympic basketball and NBA basketball was, and how, Olympic basketball, they had different defensive rules. You could play zone defense back then, and that it put a lot bigger premium at the time on three-point shooting. And they just, they took the biggest names they could find. They didn't think about three-point shooting hardly at all. They didn't think about defense hardly at all. And so you ended up with a bunch of people who were very talented, but didn't have the right skills for that task. And so that kind of thinking about talent won't really help you. But generally getting more skills, getting people who have the skills that you need to do the job is good for a team. That you should, if you have to bet on a more talented versus less talented team, you should definitely bet on the more talented team. But there is also this kind of phenomenon of too many cooks spoil the broth, where if you have too many stars who want to play the role of the star on the team at the same time, rather than people being willing to kind of sacrifice their own glory for the good of the team, that can get in the way. I think, though, that not that many organizations practically find themselves in that situation. I mean, you well might, and if you're blessed with, a lot of very talented people, maybe that's happening in your particular organization. But that on average, the bigger problem is we don't share enough of these clear goals, or we have teams that are too big, or that don't have clarity around what our roles are supposed to be in the first place, or how we're supposed to interact with one another. And that, we've seen a lot of people take these teams of stars, like Coach K with the 2008 Olympic men's basketball team, the Redeem team, to get people to buy in and subordinate, even though they're stars, to kind of subordinate their own role on the team and play together well. And that they're, again, talent's great. We should definitely want talent. So we want talent, but we have to think about skills when we're thinking about talent, and not just reputation. And that we also, really need to think about this idea of what roles are, what shared goals there are, and how we're going to create this sense of we that can transform our own individual desire for recognition.
Let's shift a little bit and talk about something that I really enjoyed reading about it, because it cemented some things for me on people that I've worked with that I thought did this really well. And that's the idea behind social sensitivity. So, what is that, and what role does it play with teams and groups?
So social sensitivity it's a facet of emotional intelligence that is about our ability to intuit the emotions of other people without being explicitly told. And it's measured with this really fun test called the Reading the Mind in the Eyes test. You can Google it and you can take it yourself. And you get these pictures of, just somebody's eyes, and then 4 choices of how that person was feeling when the photo was taken. And that what researchers have found, led by Anita Woolley at Carnegie Mellon University, was that the average level of social sensitivity on a team, so the more people who do better on this task who are on the same team, the better that team is across a variety of tasks, or what we call collective intelligence, meaning we have this kind of team-level general capability of performing well no matter what kind of task we're given. And that, it makes some sense that this is a really valuable thing in the team because, if I can figure out without being told, oh, Clint's struggling a little bit, I should help him out, or, oh, it looks like Clint's really excited about this, I can kind of catch on to that excitement or, give him more of that same kind of work. But what was surprising about this study is that social sensitivity wasn't just a predictor of collective intelligence. It was the only individual level predictor of collective intelligence. And what I mean by that is they measured everything under the sun about individuals, all the things that we think about personality, they even measured actual individual cognitive intelligence. And that those didn't predict team success. So having more smart people didn't predict team success. Having the smartest person didn't predict team success. Having, a bunch of extroverts or a bunch of conscientious people didn't predict team success. Only this social sensitivity did. Now, I think that's an important finding, but at the same time, I don't think it's the meaning of this is that every organization should go out and start measuring social sensitivity and then assembling your teams based on it. Because if you think, hey, maybe I'm not the most socially sensitive person, I actually have trouble figuring out what people are thinking and feeling without them telling me, there's a really good substitute for that. And that's asking. So if you don't know how people are thinking and feeling on your team, you should ask them. And then you get not only the benefit of, finding out for yourself, but that often we all find out. And so because the kind of function that social sensitivity serves in the team is pretty easily replaced by really good question asking and listening, that I don't think it's a good reason for most organizations to say, I'm going to assemble teams based on this, but more to share, this is something teams need to know. We need to know what each other are thinking and feeling. And it's great if we can do that without talking to one another. But it's also not that hard to just ask and have more conversations, ask more questions, and listen to what our teammates are telling us. And that is a great substitute for social sensitivity.
Yeah, I love that topic. It was very impactful for me. I want to go back real quick to the Weyerhaeuser example you gave because I should have brought it up then. But when you were talking about the goal of 90% for the trucks instead of 60 or whatever it was, you also talked about the fact that you can't just say fill it up more or do your best because without the specificity of a number, right? Because we do this all the time in project work. We'll say best in class doesn't mean anything. You got to have a goal you're trying to hit that has a number you can measure against. And that was really important because if you just said do your best, it didn't really change much. But when you said, okay, 90%, then you started to see the incremental changes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of the most durable findings in the kind of psychology of work, where if you have a challenging, clear numeric goal, that's going to help motivate performance and orient and coordinate people's actions. What's difficult is, especially if we're doing creative work and the kinds of situations I study, it's hard to do that. It's not always easy to quantify exactly what that outcome is. And I think what's important about these specific numeric goals is that we can imagine them vividly. Like in our minds, we can picture exactly what that means. And what research has found after this is we can kind of substitute for these specific numeric goals by other ways of making vivid imagery. And so we can go back to the, I guess this is, so we can look at like Steve Jobs and Microsoft in the early days, where, he articulated this goal of saying, I want to have a computer on every desk in every home. Now, that's not literally what they were. I mean, I'm sure they were trying to do that, but they could claim success without literally achieving that. But that there was something that oriented every single person in the organization to say, I know what that means. I can imagine what that looks like. I can imagine this future world that looks like this. things like JFK saying, want to put a man on the moon in 10 years. Again, everyone at NASA could imagine what that looks like. And it galvanizes organizations when we have this vivid, clear, shared understanding of what the future is supposed to look like. So if you find yourself in a situation where it's like, we don't have the metrics to know, what we're supposed to be measuring right now, or we don't have the wherewithal to do that, you should still try and work with your team to figure out what a future looks like in which you have succeeded. Even if you don't know what the thing you're making is, what the nature of the solution you're creating is, what's the world going to look like after that? And that is, as long as we have that, we can get some of these same benefits of these specific numeric challenging goals.
Okay, I love that. Here's a question for the listeners. How much would you bid to win a $1 bill? It's probably a lot more than you think. Tell us about the dollar auction experiment?
The dollar auctions, this is this old experiment in kind of economics where they would have people bid to win a dollar bill, but that these dollar auctions had a twist that the second place finisher still has to pay, but doesn't get the dollar. Now, these original studies were done in the 1970s where you could actually use a $1 bill, but now it sounds so silly to even talk about the, bidding 70 cents or 90 cents because that difference doesn't seem like anything. But Keith Murnaghan ran these studies at Northwestern, and he used a $20 bill and had an executive education class, bid to win this. And that as you would expect, what happens is, people bid less than 20, which is the rational thing to do. So you're bidding 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. But remember that as these bids are going up, the second place person's still on the hook. So that to pay what they're doing. So if you bid 11 and someone else bid 12, you've got a big incentive to bid 13. And so this competition kind of keeps ramping up. And, when these auctions end, the most extreme example that Keith said he ran, the winning bid was, I think, about $2,000, if I'm remembering right.
It is.
And, the second place person was on the hook for not much less than that. And, that's crazy for a $20 bill that we're bidding, $2,000. Winning is worse than losing in some ways if you're winning a $20 bill for $2,000. So what this really illustrates is the power of competition to motivate us. That we don't, we're not these rational economic creatures who, only do what's in our best monetary interests. That we are driven by the desire to see ourselves as superior to others who are around us. And that once we get caught up in it, we do all kinds of crazy stuff. And so competition, and this desire for social status is really important in groups, and that it drives a lot of both the good, when we were talking about the kind of positives of competition earlier in motivating better performance and setting the bar higher, but it also drives us to do some really bad stuff. And so it's although competition is baked into the systems of a lot of organizations, especially a lot of these tech firms have, kind of mandatory cuts at the bottom and a lot of ranked performance reviews, and leaderboards that they're constantly using. That definitely motivates people, but it motivates people to do both good and bad things. It's a very dangerous way to live as a leader in an organization, and to rely very, very heavily on people in your team competing against one another.
That dollar auction actually leads me into that one I can't end without asking about, is the pig and potato war of 1859, because it actually played a role in that, didn't it?
It absolutely did. So the pig and potato war, again, you can see a lot of Washington State examples here. So in the San Juan Islands, off of Washington State. At the time, so this was still, the mid 1800s. Britain and the U.S., still were not best friends at this point, and that Britain still was in charge of Canada, and so this island, it was ambiguous whether it was supposed to be part of Canada or whether it was supposed to be part of the U.S. So there were American settlers who were on this island. There were British, largely military, who were on this island, and a pig, was in the garden of one of these settlers, and it was digging up his garden, eating his potatoes. And, the settlers then, they needed those potatoes. It wasn't, it's an island. It wasn't easy to get supplies there. And so he did what people at the time would do, which is he shot the pig. And that, shooting a pig, in these kind of farming communities was a pretty routine thing that you would pay the cost of the pig to your neighbor. But it turned out the pig he had shot belonged to a British naval officer who thought an American shooting his pig was a, quote, murder and an act of war. And so he called for the American to be arrested. The American asked the American military to come to his aid. So they sent some soldiers. The British sent more soldiers. The Americans sent some warships. The British sent more warships. And this situation was just escalating out of control because a pig had eaten some potatoes from this guy's garden, as these two countries sort of, were rivaling one another to see who could amass show more power about this dispute. And actually, the what a lot of people don't know in this one is actually the order for the British to fire on the Americans and actually restart a hot war in the late 1850s was given. But this one actually, cooler heads prevailed, and that luckily the captains didn't follow the admiral's order to fire and said, this is stupid. What are we doing? We're going to start a war here. Yeah, over this. And I think what I like about that story is not just, that it's kind of a fun historical example, but that it's rare to find these examples of de-escalation once we have these conflicts and we have this rivalry and this competition and escalating conflict kind of getting hotter and hotter. But that if you look kind of underneath the surface, it shows a little bit about why this conflict didn't spill over. In a lot of ways, at this point, trade relations between the two countries had been strengthening. That the tobacco and cotton and grain were going back and forth. At the time, that a lot of British banks had invested very heavily in the 19th century America, and that. But I think really importantly, this was in the Pacific Ocean. And the British getting a bunch more ships over to the Pacific Ocean was a lot harder than getting it into the East Coast of America. And that America and Britain had a lot of common enemies at this time. That the French weren't very popular. They were kind of doing a bunch of things in Mexico at the time. There's actually these very strange opium wars in the kind of Chinese sea routes at the time. But there was really this interdependence between the two countries, that they had more shared goals, that even when they were rivals, it was a lot harder for that rivalry to spill over into active conflict because of all this interdependence. And I think the lesson that this one teaches us, that's so rare, is these times where actually the worst didn't happen, right? That we have so many stories of escalating conflict and revenge, and then countries start fighting. And so looking at these examples of a time where countries came really close, but then somehow they were able to back off, and how they created those conditions to back off. And those conditions almost always are cooperation and shared goals and interdependence. And that the more we create that, the more it buffers us against these really destructive episodes of conflict.
Yeah, it's pretty hard for cooler heads to prevail if there's only one head in the room.
Yeah, that's right.
So you talk about the sunk cost fallacy, and I see that all the time in project work where the team will be working diligently on product development for 12 months, and then the customer goes away. And really there's no reason to finish that project. The only customer for it is no longer there. And yet the team is always like, well, we've invested all this time. Let's just go ahead and push it across the finish line. And it's you have to convince them now you're throwing good money after bad. This 12 months is sunk. It's done. And you have to look at, do I really want to invest another 6 months worth of effort into a product for which there's no customer? And that's really hard. So how do we convince a team to move on when you have that situation?
I mean, you really do often need that outside perspective in those cases. So it's very hard. The sunk cost fallacy has a name, again, because it's so pervasive in our psychology. It takes us a lot of effort to overcome it. And this was, what was at work in the dollar auction as well, where we were seeing, people throwing good money after bad, not just, a few dollars, but, paying, 100 times what something's worth, because they're stuck in this arms race of sunk costs. So I think the best way is, again, to first have a group at all, right? Like as you say, it's a lot harder for cooler heads or it's easier for cooler heads to prevail if we have more heads around to be cool. But that, especially when we're working hard on something, that groups develop kind of their own reality. And that some of the important research has been the importance of groups not becoming so insular that they never get outside opinions, that they never hear, somebody kind of hold up a mirror to what they're doing and how they're thinking about things. And that actually the most successful groups have a little bit of porous boundaries. They have, a network of advisors that they go to, that they're asking for a lot of outside feedback and making sure that they're doing these reality checks, knowing that, groups have this pressure to conform within them. And over time, we start to think alike. We start to see the world similarly. And it becomes harder and harder for us to kind of make these level-headed decisions within the group. So getting an outside perspective, keeping that healthy diet of information flowing from outside your borders, I think is one of the best ways.
And I want to be respectful of time. I know we've been going for a while. I'm going to try to squeeze 3 questions, then I'll be done. So a major theme of my work is obviously around conversation. And I was wondering, in your research, what role does conversation play in determining whether a group succeeds or not?
Conversations are, the way we do most of the work that we do in teams, that our communication is largely in this kind of back and forth dialogue. And so although we need these kind of structures of goals and norms and tasks and composition of groups to succeed, the actual work that we're doing is going to be done through conversation. And that I think one of the important things about conversation is, I'm sure what you've talked about on this before. I've seen some of my colleagues who study psychological safety and kind of group process. But that, when we have this sense that it's okay for us to take risks in what we say to one another, that we can speak up, that we can make suggestions, that we can ask questions, even questions that might seem like dumb questions, those are the lifeblood of a team continuing to learn and get better and align expectations. And so if we do, even if we get everything else right, if we don't have these healthy conversations where we're actually saying what we really think, where we ask questions about what we're actually curious about or what we don't know, we're not going to have a successful team. So I think, when it gets right down to it, what we see in teams as success or failure, manifests in the conversations they're having, or often the conversations that they're not having. And I was, one of the funniest examples I've run across is a top management team where they got to the point where you'd watch them and they were talking about all this trivial stuff in their top management team meetings about the agenda and where we're going to have the company retreat. And the researcher asked them, it's like, well, why aren't you guys talking about the company strategy? It's like, well, we can't talk about the company strategy. We all, that's a sore issue. It's like, well, what are you doing? Why do you exist if you're not going to have a conversation about this? So often it's not only the conversations we are having, but the conversations we're not having that are telling us, that are the signal about how healthy our group is.
So you're speaking about psychological safety, and I'm wondering, obviously during the pandemic, everybody went either fully remote or hybrid in some way. And while that's reversed a bit, it's not 100% back in the office. And when you talk about remote work and hybrid work, how can groups maintain that groupiness we talked about earlier in the conversation when your distances is psychological and physical distances is higher?
Yeah. It's harder. That there's no way around it, that our brains weren't wired to, perceive other people as acutely through a screen. That when we're in the rooms with other people, we pick up more cues, we see more about their body language, we can sort of feel more in the tone of voice and when we're supposed to talk. Even, talking as we are, at a great physical distance, there's more of a time lag in our conversation, and we have to make small adjustments in how we act. So I think the first thing is just for leaders to acknowledge that that's going to be true. We gain some things in flexibility, in who we can involve in our teams by the ability to, collaborate virtually and over great distances. But that we lose a little bit of our ability to really perceive each other's emotions and thoughts accurately. And again, I think the best way to handle this is to first acknowledge that, and then to start to put in place norms that are meant to narrow that gap a little bit. And that may be explicitly asking, if we're going to have more trouble figuring out how people are feeling or what they're thinking, to ask them to do that. To use some of the alternative channels we have when we're communicating virtually, that we aren't limited to just waiting for each other to speak. We've got chats, we've got these kinds of polls if you have a bigger group and you're trying to figure out how they're feeling. And that a lot of groups I've seen who are managing this more successfully have little rituals that they're doing to kind of personalize each other again, whether it's, kind of taking turns in a little bit of a show and tell about something that's going on in them, about, sharing a little bit about their lives and kind of reminding one another of our humanness. But that I think, whatever makes sense for you is I think better than nothing, but that it's going to be a problem, and that it's going to, I think we're all getting better at virtual teaming than we used to be, but we are going to lose something in terms of the ability to create psychological safety and maintain it. And, coming back to this idea of being the repeater in chief, if you want people to speak up and share what they're thinking, to take these interpersonal risks, to try new things or ask questions when they have them, you can't just say it once at the beginning. You have to continually do this. And I think some teams where they have, a lot of virtual work, I've seen a lot of them where their cover slide or their background is this set of norms about how I want us to behave in these virtual meetings, because we need that repetition. We need that reminders that this is not, the natural way that we're all used to interacting. And so we need some guidance on how we're going to interact in those situations.
Yeah, I think the challenge there is I see people turn their cameras off. They're on mute. I mean, we're 7 years into this thing, and we're still having to tell people, hey, come off mute. I mean, so it's definitely hardwired in. And then you can't read the people's faces like we talked about earlier with the social intelligence, where you can't read the eyes because they're off camera, or if they're on camera, they're muted. So you can't hear the deep sigh that clearly they don't agree with what just got said. So there's all these cues that you lose. So it makes it a lot harder.
Yeah, it does make it a lot harder. And it's also, the flip side of that is, for organizations that have kind of responded by saying we're going to be in constant virtual meetings, that's leading people to need to turn their cameras off more, because it is more tiring for us to, look at ourselves on the screen. I think people find that more stressful than most of us had anticipated when you're doing that all day, every day. So we have a new article coming out about kind of making the most of hybrid work. And the thing I think people aren't doing enough of is scheduling this kind of balance between, if we're going to all come into the office on Wednesdays, Wednesday can't become just a nonstop stream of meetings, because we're not going to get those spontaneous hallway interactions if, we spend all day scheduled up to the gills with everyone trying to meet. It's the same if we're all, have this string of virtual meetings, that we need variety in our work days, that we need breaks from different kinds of collaboration and work, and that we need to think harder about building the kind of rhythm of work days into this new world where we have this kind of back and forth that as we're doing different kinds of back to the office initiatives, we're running into new kinds of problems where people are not getting the results that they were hoping to get from hybrid work.
Where's that article going to be published? Because I'm interested in reading that for sure.
Yeah, they'll be in Rotman Magazine. I don't think they've given us a date, but it'll probably be kind of late summer, early fall.
I'll keep a lookout for that, because that's definitely up my alley. I want to read it.
Yeah.
All right, last question. You spent your career studying groups. What is one belief about teamwork, leadership, collaboration, or conversation that you wish every executive would unlearn?
I wish I had a more profound one than this one, but I think the one that I really wish people would unlearn is that the best way to share information is to call a meeting. And that I think so many executives call these big meetings because it's easier for them.
Yeah.
It's, there's like, oh, now I don't have to think about how I communicate this to a whole bunch of people. But that, once that norm starts to pervade an organization, information sharing meetings start to creep up everywhere, because then all leaders at all levels start to do this. And that's where, this is what gives groups a bad name. And I think this is why this is such a kind of passionate, trivial point for me. Is people have such a bias against the potential of groups because they're in so many ineffective meetings that should have been an email. And the meetings that, at this point often should be a video. Right? Like a lot of times if it's like, you don't want to write the email, just turn on your camera and tell everyone what you were going to tell them, and that we'll all watch it when we need to watch it. But so I think the information sharing meeting is killing so many organizations, and it's killing the culture of teamwork in them, because people, develop this aversion to trying to do things in groups or to calling another meeting that actually would be functional, because we've already got too many of them. So I wish I had like a profound
that's good.
triumph over individualism end to it. But yeah, that's definitely what's coming to mind.
Probably seen the Dilbert cartoon, but if you haven't, I'll try to find it for you. There's one where the point area boss talks about a meeting they're going to have on Friday, and then somebody says, we should have a meeting on Wednesday to discuss the topics of what's going to be in the meeting on Friday. And then Wally, the ne'er-do-well, says, well, really, we should have a meeting on Monday to discuss the pre-meeting. And Dilbert looks at me and goes, you're my hero. It's just, you have your pre-meetings to get to the pre-meeting to get to the meeting. So yeah, it could definitely be overkill.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, you haven't moved to the UK yet either. They love it even more than most US organizations here.
Well, Colin, this has really been great. I appreciate all your time today. If people want to learn more about you and the work you do, how can they do that?
So you can go to my website at colinmfisher.com, and you can follow me on most social platforms at Colin M. Fisher, especially LinkedIn. And I write a Substack newsletter where I share fun little nuggets like this and kind of outgrowths of what I'm up to.
The book is The Collective Edge. Highly recommended. I had a great time reading it, learned a lot, including some new words I didn't know before. So thank you so much for the conversation, Colin.
Thanks so much for having me, Clint. It was a blast.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation. To find out more about Clint, go to ClintonMPaget.com and pick up Clint's book, How Teams Triumph, Managing by Commitment, at Amazon. The Conversation with Clinton M. Paget is a production of Forbes Books.